Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I am finally bringing you my wrap up for June, which was Queer Pride Month. I meant to film this so many times and then life intervened, so finally I'm doing it. At least we're not quite a month past. So in June I managed to read 5 out of the 10 books that I had on my TBR. Plus I read one other book that featured queer stories. So I was very pleased with what I did read, even though I would have been happier if I could have read just a little bit more. The first book that I finished was Hurricane Child by Callender, who I believe is now Kacen Callender. I will leave a link down below and that will have the correct name for this author because they changed their name in between the book being published and now. So this book was really wonderful. It's a middle grade magical realism story about this very strong-willed, very stubborn little girl who lives in the Caribbean, and she's dealing with a lot of frustration and a lot of self-doubt because her mother has left. Her mother left over a year ago, and the main character, Caroline, really misses her mother and doesn't understand why she left. And she wants to go and find her mother. So this is a big part of the storyline, but another part of the storyline is that Caroline is gay, and she's very young. She's in elementary school, and she falls in love with one of her new classmates. And so this story sort of mixes all of these things together, her frustrations and fear and worry about her mother being gone and trying to find her, difficulties at school. Her classmates, not the new one, but the other ones, are all pretty mean. She gets very bullied by them and just kind of trying to deal with that. And also, with all of this going on, there's also magic in the background. So Caroline sees ghosts and doesn't really know if the ghosts are, nice ghosts or mean ghosts or what is going on. And so there's just a whole atmosphere of kind of magic and the unknown that's going on in the background. So it's really a great story, very gripping read. I really enjoyed it. I loved the characters, and I really liked how the story progressed and how Caroline grew as a character. So this was a great read. Next, I finished Fire Song by Adam Garnet Jones, and this story was really gorgeous. I loved Jones's writing. Just so much imagery, so much beauty in the writing, and the setting was really fascinating too. So it takes place on a reservation in Canada and follows an Indigenous boy, Shane, who is kind of 18. He is going to be leaving the reservation to go to college outside, and there's a lot going on for him. His life is kind of falling apart around him, and he is sort of in the closet, gay. He's got a girlfriend who is a close friend, but he also has a lover, David, and David and he have this very secret relationship because in their community it is definitely not okay to be gay. And so while Shane is dealing with a ton of issues, especially difficulties regarding his sister having committed suicide just a couple months before, and his mom sort of having a big mental breakdown, all of that, along with being in love and not being able to express it. So this book was filled with a lot of drama, but it was also really moving, and I thought that representation of life on the reservation and dealing with sort of extreme poverty was really moving and fascinating and just a great read. So there was a lot to offer in this book, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. Next, I finished When the Moon Was Ours by Anna Marie McLemore, and this story was sort of a fairy tale, magical realism, modern story where magic was very much integrated into the normality of life. The main characters both are somewhat unusual. So the main boy, Sam, is trans. and that's a big part of this story. And his girlfriend is sort of a little bit magical herself. She has roses which grow out of her wrists, and a lot of this story revolves around another group of girls who are kind of the mean girls. There's some sisters and they're magical as well, and they sort of terrorize these two for being different. And Sam is dealing with trying to understand what his identity is. He was born a girl, but decided very young that he wanted to be male because his mother didn't have anybody around to protect her, and he thought, you know, he could fill that masculine role. And now he's reaching adulthood and not really sure if he wants to continue as male or if he wants to go back to being female. You know, was this just a temporary thing to protect his mother while he was growing up, or is this really who he is? Is this his identity? So he's struggling with that a lot. This book had, again, beautiful writing, very, very lyrical. I mean, really, truly, this gorgeous fairy tale feel to the story. But again, a lot of emotional issues, a lot of drama that happens in that. So if you like that kind of gripping emotional roller coaster ride, this is definitely for you. I really got a lot out of understanding these perspectives, and I felt like this was a really great way to, you know, see somebody who's struggling with what is their identity, and do they really feel like they are male or they are female, and how does that work with the people around them? So that was a really interesting exploration. Next, I finished Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson. This is sort of like a fictionalized memoir. So Jeanette Winterson writes this story about her childhood in the 60s. Growing up, she was adopted by a very evangelical family. And she tells this story, but maybe with a little bit of fictionalization of the account. So it's not strictly a memoir, but it's very close to what her actual experiences growing up were. And she grew up with a mother who adopted her with the idea of creating a child who would do God's work, who would be a missionary and sort of fulfill this grand purpose. And so Jeanette Winterson's childhood was very crazy. A lot of the anecdotes from this are so funny because of how ridiculous they are. But she grows up and she realizes that she's gay, and that is not okay, and it causes a big rift between her and her mother and her and her church, and that's problematic because this was her whole life. So it's definitely a powerful read. I got a little bit lost in the second half because there was a bit more literary aspects of that I didn't quite follow, but it was really interesting kind of reading about somebody whose whole life was based on something that wouldn't work with who she discovered herself to be. So, good read. Next, I finished Redefining Realness by Janet Mock, and this is a memoir. So this is a memoir of Janet Mock's childhood through early adulthood. Janet Mock is a semi-famous person. She was an editor for People magazine, I believe, and she has since become a spokeswoman for trans education and rights. So she is a trans woman, and she grew up in Hawaii and partially also in California and Texas. And she knew from a very, very young age that she was female. She knew that that's kind of who she was, but it wasn't really accepted by the people around her. And there was a lot of kind of this push to be more masculine. But she kind of talks about all of those experiences and about her realizing that, no, I need to go forward with this. I am female. And that whole transition process for her, and she really makes a point not just of telling her story, but also of educating the reader, presenting a lot of information and facts about trans lives, as well as sort of advice as to what you can do, or how to create safe places, or how to deal with a child who is not really sure what their identity is, or who is sure what their identity is, but it just doesn't match what they were born as. And so there's a lot of really good information in this, as well as a good story. And Janet Monk is not just a trans woman, but she is a minority. She grew up in very difficult circumstances with a lot of poverty and a lot of neglect and also abuse, not necessarily from her direct family, but from, you know, people nearby. And it's a little bit of a heavy read because a lot happens to her, but she is a strong person and she gets through it. And I think that the book offers just a really good insight into some of the extreme struggles that trans women have to go through. So it was very informative in that way, and I thought it was a really good, very worthwhile read. Lastly, I finished something a little bit lighter, The Prince and the Dressmaker by Jen Wang. And this is a graphic novel with absolutely gorgeous art. I really loved the art, about a prince who is a cross-dresser, and he loves haute couture, he loves fashion, and he hires this dressmaker to make all of these gorgeous dresses for him so that he could go out and cross-dress at night. And this is set maybe around the turn of the century, around 1900, maybe late 1800s. And this story kind of follows him as he and the dressmaker become close friends, and as he explores this sort of new persona of his. And it's really sweet and really beautiful, but also covers a lot of issues of kind of coming out, because he's a prince and he's not supposed to be a cross-dresser, and he's got a lot of obligations to his family, and he doesn't feel like he can come out and tell them kind of what he cares about and what matters to him and how he feels. So there's a lot of tension there between that obligation to conform to society and the expectations of you, as well as trying to follow your own path. So it's a very sweet story with still quite a lot of content in it, and it was just a joy to read, so I loved it. So now that I've talked about the books that I finished this month, I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the themes that I noticed across these books. I think that by focusing on a single topic each month, I get a nice chance to see if there are themes that come up again and again in each of these books, and there definitely were. So one of the themes that I noticed that was very, very strong was how to reconcile your culture and your identity. For a lot of the authors and a lot of the characters in these books, there was a real conflict between what their kind of home culture or social culture, what that required of them, and then what their actual identity was. And that intersectionality of their identities meant that sometimes they felt that they couldn't have both. And that was a very difficult experience for a lot of these characters. Just trying to navigate how to be a part of a culture that you value, but also not give up your identity when that culture judges the identity pretty harshly. So that was a real big theme. This was really, really prevalent in Fire Song, especially not as much with the main character Shane, but his boyfriend David. So David comes from this family of people who are big cultural leaders. They're the ones who perform the ceremonies in their community. They're the ones who hold on to the lore. And that's a big responsibility, and it's one that David takes very, very seriously. He deeply cares about their history, about their community, about their culture. He deeply wants to continue to be the successor in his family for all of that history and culture. But he also knows that if he comes out as gay, he likely won't be able to continue with that because that's just not accepted. So that's a really harsh thing for David, and he struggles throughout the book with how to balance that with also knowing that he cares deeply about Shane and wanting that to be a part of his life as well. So he feels very, very torn between these two. In Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, Jeanette Winterson, similarly, she grows up in this super, super, super evangelical Christian household and church community. That is her life. That is everything to her. That is all that she is, and she is so good at it. She is somebody who is thoroughly thoroughly involved in church life. She, really participates in all of the different aspects, and she's so good at it. And this is sort of the definition almost of her life. But when she realizes that she's gay, she gets pushed out of that church, and she's sort of lost because she has this identity. She knows that she's gay, and that is who she is, and yet to have lost kind of the foundation that built her life and those things that she found so much meaning in was very, very difficult and very harsh for her. So that kind of wanting so badly to be a part of your community and not being allowed to because of, your sexual identity, that was really rough for her. Similarly, in The Prince and the Dressmaker, the prince, he feels so much obligation towards his family and towards being a prince. A big part of the storyline is that he's supposed to find a bride and get married and, continue the succession, the line of the royal family. And he feels that obligation. He wants to perform it. He wants to do what is required of him as a prince and to live up to the expectations of his father and his mother. He wants to do what is right, but at the same time, it's so hard for him to pretend to be just this, masculine prince when really on the inside, he just wants to wear beautiful dresses. And so there's that conflict again between what he personally wants and what he feels his identity is, and that community and culture that he belongs to and wanting to fulfill his role there. So for all of these, it's just this idea that sometimes when you have an intersectional identity where one part of it greatly disagrees with another part of it, that's a very tough place to be. And these authors and characters feel super torn, feeling like they have to make a choice and choose one or the other. And that is just tearing them apart inside. Another theme that I saw throughout these books was the fear and the pain of rejection. So when your community does not approve of who you are and what your kind of identity is, there's a lot of fear if that gets out, or pain of people rejecting you if it is out, if you've decided to be out and they are judging you harshly. So this comes up in pretty much every book. I think in Hurricane Child, the bullying that Caroline, the main character, experienced is so extreme. I mean, the other children are just merciless to her even before it comes out that she's gay. And then once it comes out that she's gay, there's so much as well. And there's just so much pain there in terms of how cruel these children are to her. In Fire Song, like I said before, David as well as Shane, there's so much fear of it coming out that they're gay. And you see throughout the book in the first half, the other teenage kids majorly tease David because he's very effeminate. So he's not out as gay, but he's very effeminate. And even just with the thought that he seems like he might be gay, the other teenagers are so mean to him and so cruel. And Shane, the main character, seems totally masculine and he's fine and he's friends with these other teenagers. And he kind of sees the way that they treat Shane, and it's just this harsh thing of, they're so afraid of what will happen and how they'll be treated if they come out. Even just the hint that they might be gay is enough to provoke that kind of bullying and that kind of shaming. As well as just the fear of their family's reactions is pretty big. In When the Moon Was Ours, there is a huge fear on Sam and his girlfriend's part that the truth about his birth certificate will come out because the school has the birth certificate. Even though Sam moved to the community when he was pretty young, but already when he was stating that his identity was male. And so everybody in the town knows him only as male. And everybody believes that, but there's this issue with the birth certificate maybe getting out and how that will affect the way that people see him. And, will people say, oh, you've been lying to us, when it's not a lie, it's just that they don't quite understand what, Sam is going through. And that also people will intentionally misgender him and just not see him as he is. They'll have this other lens. And so that's a big part of the storyline. And as I've said before, in The Prince and the Dressmaker, the prince is just terrified that people are going to find out that he's a cross-dresser, to the extent that he makes a lot of bad choices. And he makes some choices that are really quite cruel to his friend, the dressmaker, just because he can't even allow the slightest possibility that it might get out that he's a cross-dresser. And so he makes some bad choices out of that fear. So fear and pain are big parts of a lot of these books, which is a difficult thing. You know, you want to believe that the world's kind of getting to be a better place, but maybe not so much. But it's just such a huge theme, that fear and that pain and just the rejection. One other theme that I noticed that wasn't exactly in the stories I was reading, but more in the conversation around the stories that I was reading, is an idea of representation and an idea of seeing yourself represented in what you read. So I think that there is a great idea during Pride Month that we should be reading queer voices. There's an idea that we should be reading books by people and about people who represent all these different identities, and that's important. And there's also a lot of people who are talking about how important it is and how validated they feel when the stories they read represent their experiences. So just for an example, not necessarily related to queer books, but I just recently saw a little mini 10-minute documentary, which I will link below, interviewing Jason Reynolds, talking about his experiences as an author. He's a poet and writes also YA novels. And he talked about when he was growing up not reading books that he saw characters like himself. And so his decision to go into YA was very motivated by the idea of giving young Black kids books where they are the central characters. And I think that that's really, it makes so much sense. You know, you feel so validated when you read characters that you can connect to and that you can empathize with, that represent your experiences. Also, coming back to kind of queer Pride Month, Jessie from Bowties Books put out a video, which I will also link below, talking about how it's so great that everybody really wants to make sure that we focus on reading more queer authors and queer voices and queer characters, and that it's a very good intent, but that sometimes we fall a little short when it comes to representation, in that we might have a lot of gay and lesbian stories on our TBRs, but might not do so great with coming up with like trans or non-binary or asexual stories, and that it's really important that we make a point of seeing those stories and representing those stories as well, especially because when you're out there clamoring and buying these new release books and everything like that, that's sending messages to publishers of what we want. And so it's good to make sure that we remember to also look for other voices and not just the kind of gay and lesbian side of the queer spectrum, but also making sure that we're reading and caring about other identities. And you know, I also really noticed that Njeri from ONYX Pages, she had a video, which I will link below as well, talking about reading Hurricane Child and how that just meant so much to her, because the main character is gay, she's Black, she's growing up in the Caribbean, and that really connected with Njeri and made her wish that that sort of book was around when she was growing up, and how impactful that could have been, and how great it could be for kids now. So I think that what I've heard a lot of people talking about is just how much it means to them to see themselves represented in the books that they read. So I definitely noticed that, and it's very much in the back of my mind that when I go out and choose books, I need to be conscious of whose voices I'm listening to, who is being represented, who am I allowing to be heard by my choices. I think a lot of the time readers don't intentionally exclude voices, but sometimes by the very nature of the way that those who are already in power continue to have more power and their voices are amplified, you have to make a little bit of a conscious effort to see who isn't being listened to and kind of go out and seek out those stories. So lastly, I just wanted to give you a couple of recommendations. If you don't have time to read all of the books that I've talked about from this month, I wanted to give you my top 3 that I would recommend you pick up. So the first of these is Hurricane Child. I think that this was just such a lovely book. I thought that the main character, Caroline, was so wonderful. She was stubborn and she was just gonna do what she was gonna do. I really loved that. I also just loved the Caribbean setting. I loved the magical realism. I thought it was an excellent book, and because it's middle grade, I think it's really great to give to somebody who's maybe a little bit younger in your life. But really, I'm an adult and I loved it as well. So it was a great book. The second book I would recommend is Redefining Realness by Janet. This seems to me like a great primer to kind of the experience of a trans woman, especially if you don't know much about the trans experience. I think this provides a lot of education as well as really fascinating stories. I definitely don't know as much as I want to know about what it's like for people growing up as trans, and I found this really educational and just very engrossing. And the last book that I want to recommend is The Prince and the Dressmaker, partially just because it was so sweet and so cute and I loved the art, but also because I feel like this truly is all ages. I feel like very young kids can read this as well as adults, and it just presents another viewpoint and really talks about the conflict between your inner identity and kind of the way that you present yourself to the world, and how important it is to, as a family, as a community, support people in them expressing their identities. So that wraps up Queer Pride Month for me. I had a great time reading these books. Again, I really wish I'd had time to read more because I had so many good ones on my TBR. If you guys read stuff for June for Pride Month, please let me know down below what you read, what your favorites were, so I can add them to my TBR for sometime in the future. And if you read any of the ones that I did, please tell me what you thought of them below.